She had only her life left, yet the cowboy still dragged the frozen Nez Perce woman inside. The wind howled, cutting through the frozen wasteland like a sharp knife. The vast plains were covered in a thick blanket of snow, stretching out as far as the eye could see. The world seemed still, silent, and cruel. Only the sound of hooves crunching in the snow and the creaking of a horse's saddle disturbed the eerie quiet. Jesse Dust McAllister had seen many things in his years as a cowboy: desolate lands, brutal storms, and the kind of men who thought they could conquer anything. But nothing had ever felt quite like this. The wind whipped fiercely at his face, biting through his thick coat, and the cold seeped into his bones. Yet he didn't stop. On his horse's back, a woman lay unconscious, barely alive. Her name was Taya, a Nez Perce woman, and she was clinging to life with everything she had left. Jesse had found her just hours before, deep in the snow, hidden beneath a pile of frozen branches, her skin blue with the cold. The scene had been ugly. A skirmish between her people and a group of rogue settlers had gone terribly wrong, and Taya had been left for dead. Her people had fled, leaving her behind to face the storm. Jesse didn't understand the full story, but that didn't matter. He had found her, and that was all that mattered. She was human. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's mother. He couldn't leave her to die out here. The storm was relentless, and the snow fell heavier with every minute that passed. Jesse's horse struggled through the drifts, each step sinking deeper into the snow. He pushed it harder, knowing that they couldn't stop now. The nearest town was miles away, and without shelter, Taya wouldn't survive much longer. He glanced at her, her face pale, her lips a deep shade of blue. He reached down, making sure she was still wrapped in the thick blanket he had thrown over her, doing his best to shield her from the biting wind. He didn't have much with him. His gear was minimal, just a few supplies he had picked up from his last stop, but he had to make it work. He had to save her. Hours passed. Jesse's hands were numb from the cold, his eyes stinging from the icy wind. His horse's breathing was shallow, and it was struggling more with each step. Jesse urged it on, not stopping to rest, not even for a moment. He knew they had to keep going. The storm wouldn't let up. Finally, in the distance, he saw something. A dark shape through the swirling snow. A building, barely visible through the whiteout. His heart quickened. It could be shelter. It had to be. He urged his horse faster, pushing it toward the shape. It wasn't much, just a small abandoned cabin tucked away in the hills. But it was enough. As Jesse pulled the horse to a stop in front of the cabin, he quickly jumped off and lifted Taya from the saddle. He had to move fast. She was barely alive, and if he didn't get her inside soon, she might not make it. He carried her inside the cabin, careful not to jostle her too much. The cabin was empty, cold, and dark, but it would have to do. Jesse quickly gathered some dry wood from a pile in the corner and set up a small fire in the stone fireplace. It didn't take long for the flames to grow, casting a warm glow in the otherwise dark room. Taya's breath was shallow, and her body was stiff with cold. Jesse worked quickly, pulling off her frozen coat and wrapping her in blankets to try to warm her. He wasn't sure what else to do. He had no medical supplies, no healer with him, just his hands, his fire, and his determination to keep her alive. He knelt beside her, his eyes scanning her face for any signs of life. She was still breathing, but it was weak. Her skin was pale, and her lips remained the same deep shade of blue. Jesse bit his lip, frustration bubbling inside him. There had to be something more he could do. He reached for his coat, pulling out a flask of water. He carefully poured a small amount onto a cloth and wiped her forehead, hoping it might help ease the fever that was surely creeping in. He then covered her with more blankets, trying to trap any warmth that could get into her body. Minutes passed, and then hours. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin there was a small flicker of hope. Jesse kept the fire going, feeding it with small logs to ensure they wouldn't run out of warmth. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. Not while she was still fighting for her life. Every now and then he checked on her, adjusting the blankets, making sure she was still breathing. Her body was still cold, but Jesse could feel the faintest warmth in her chest now. By morning the storm had begun to ease up, and the sky was clearer. The light of day filtered in through the cracks in the cabin's walls, revealing the full extent of the storm's damage. The ground outside was a vast sea of white, untouched by anything but the blowing snow. She was still alive, still here. That was something. Her breathing was a little steadier now, though still ragged. Jesse let out a quiet sigh of relief. He had done what he could. Now all he could do was wait. The hours passed slowly, but by late afternoon Taya began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she was disoriented. Jesse quickly stood and knelt beside her. "Easy now," he said in a quiet, steady voice. "You're safe. You're in a cabin. You're gonna be all right." Her eyes darted around, confused, then landed on him. Her voice was weak, but it came out in a strained whisper. "Who are you?" Jesse smiled faintly. "Name's Jesse. Jesse McAllister. I found you out in the snow. You were close to gone. I had to bring you here." She blinked, trying to focus. "You saved me?" Jesse nodded. "You were too far gone for anyone else. But I couldn't leave you. Not out there." "Not like that." Taya looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to trust him. Then she closed her eyes as though the weight of the world was on her shoulders. Jesse watched her, unsure of what to say next. He wasn't a man of many words, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't about to let this woman die. Not while he could help her, not while there was still a chance. The storm had passed, but the battle for survival was far from over. The fire crackled in the small cabin, sending bright flickers of light against the walls. Jesse sat nearby, watching Taya closely as she slept, her body still wrapped in blankets. The warmth from the fire barely reached the edges of the room, but inside the small circle of heat, there was a strange feeling of calm. Taya had been unconscious for 2 days. Her breathing had steadied, and she no longer seemed to be fighting for every breath. The frostbite that had covered her hands and feet was slowly healing, though the damage would be permanent. Jesse had seen enough people freeze to know that there was no quick fix to a frozen body. He had done everything he could. Now he could only wait. Taya stirred in her sleep, her brow furrowing slightly. Jesse immediately rose to check on her, his boots scraping softly on the wooden floor. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, confused at first. Then they fixed on him, sharp with curiosity. "You're awake," Jesse said, his voice soft but steady. He took a step closer, careful not to startle her. Taya blinked, trying to focus. Her skin was still pale, but the fever that had burned through her body was finally gone. She wasn't as cold as she had been, but her body was still weak from the ordeal. She took a shallow breath, then another, steadying herself. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, but there was a clarity in her eyes that wasn't there before. "You're in a cabin," Jesse explained, settling down beside her. "I brought you here after I found you out in the snow." Taya looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You saved me, but why?" Her words were laced with suspicion, as if she couldn't understand why a stranger would risk his life for her. Jesse paused. He had never been good at explaining his actions, especially not to someone like her. But something about her fight for survival, had touched him in a way he couldn't explain. He simply didn't want to let her die out there. "I couldn't leave you behind," he said quietly, his gaze not meeting hers. "It wasn't right. Nobody deserves to die like that." Taya studied him for a long moment, her eyes filled with questions, but she didn't speak. Instead, she pushed herself up into a sitting position slowly, as if every movement was a struggle. Her body was still stiff, but the pain was fading. Jesse moved to help her, but she waved him off, not wanting to be dependent on anyone. "I need to get back to my people," she said, her voice stronger now, though still strained. "I can't stay here." He knew she wouldn't stay forever. Her tribe, the Nez Perce, had been scattered by the settlers. He had heard stories of their flight into the mountains to escape the violence, but he couldn't let her go just yet. Not when she was still so weak. "You're not going anywhere," Jesse said firmly, though his tone wasn't unkind. "You need to rest. You can't be moving around like this yet." Taya looked at him, clearly not pleased with his words, but she didn't argue. She didn't have the strength to. For now, all she could do was lie back down and let her body heal. "I've been through worse," she muttered, more to herself than to Jesse. "I can handle it." He knew better than to argue with someone who had been through as much as she had. He understood survival better than most. He had lived through storms, long nights, and worse. But watching her struggle with something she couldn't control, her body, her situation, was harder than he thought. Days passed in silence, with the only sounds being the crackle of the fire and the soft wind that whistled through the cracks in the cabin. Jesse stayed busy, checking the fire, gathering more wood from outside, and making sure Taya had enough food and water. Every day he could see her strength returning. Her eyes became clearer, her body less stiff, but she still wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon and the orange light filled the room, Taya finally spoke again. "Why are you here, really?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. "I've seen men like you, men who don't care about anyone but themselves. What's different about you?" Jesse paused in his work, his hand hovering over the fire. He didn't know how to answer her. It was a question that had been on his mind ever since he found her out there in the snow. He wasn't a hero, not by any stretch of the imagination. He was just a man who had been passing through, trying to survive the way he always had. But for some reason, when he found Taya, he couldn't just walk away. "I don't know," Jesse said finally, his voice quieter now. Maybe I just couldn't leave you to die. Maybe it's as simple as that." Taya nodded, as if understanding more than Jesse had expected. Her eyes softened, but she didn't speak for a long time. The fire crackled between them, its warmth a reminder of the fragility of life. "I owe you my life," she said eventually. "I will repay you somehow." Jesse didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't expecting anything in return. He wasn't the kind of man who did things for a reward. He just wanted to get her back on her feet, to help her survive. That was enough for him. The next morning, when the sun was bright in the sky, Taya was up and moving more easily. Her strength had returned enough that she was no longer confined to her bed. She stood up carefully, testing her legs, then walked over to the window to look outside. "It's getting better," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "The storm's passed." Jesse glanced over at her, seeing the determination in her eyes. It was the same look he had seen in soldiers, in survivors, in people who refused to give up. She wasn't ready to give up, even when it seemed like the world was against her. "Yeah," he replied. "It's over. But that doesn't mean you're ready to go anywhere yet. You still need to rest." Taya didn't argue this time. Instead, she looked back at him, a quiet thanks in her gaze. For the first time since Jesse had found her, he saw something other than pain in her eyes. He saw a glimmer of trust. They didn't speak much after that. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly in the cabin, with nothing but the sound of the wind and the occasional crackle of the fire to break the silence. But Jesse could feel the weight of the days passing, and he knew it wouldn't be long before Taya would be strong enough to leave. And when that time came, he wasn't sure what he would do. She had her own people to find, her own battles to fight. He had his own journey to continue, but for now they were together, and that was enough. Days turned into weeks in the small cabin as Jesse kept watch over Taya, making sure she had everything she needed. The cold outside was no longer a constant threat, but the isolation of the cabin seemed to settle into their bones. The storm had passed, but the struggles were far from over. Taya had grown stronger with each passing day. She was no longer the fragile woman he had found on the edge of death. Her skin had regained some color, her movements were steadier, and her mind seemed clearer. But even as she recovered physically, Jesse could see the weight of the world in her eyes. The look that had first greeted him when she awoke had faded, replaced by a quiet determination. One morning, as the first light of dawn poured through the cracks in the cabin, Taya sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a mug of warm water. Jesse noticed that her eyes were focused, distant, as if lost in thought. "Is something on your mind?" he asked gently, sitting across from her. Taya didn't immediately respond. She stared into the flames, her expression thoughtful, then finally sighed. "I should be out there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't be resting in this cabin. I should be out there with my people, finding them. I can't waste time." Jesse watched her closely, understanding the urgency in her voice. She had spoken little of her tribe since he found her, but he knew enough to understand what she was running from. Her people, the Nez Perce, had been pushed to the brink of destruction. Their lands had been taken, their lives threatened by settlers and mercenaries. They were scattered, fighting to survive. "I get it," Jesse said, "but you're not ready yet. You're stronger, but you still need time." Taya's eyes flickered with a mix of frustration and acceptance. She didn't argue. She had been weak, helpless for so long, and now that she could finally move, the last thing she wanted was to remain in one place. "I know," she said softly, "but I can't sit here forever. My people need me." Jesse nodded, his gaze softening. He understood more than she realized. He had lived a life of wandering, moving from place to place, always searching for something but never finding it. He had never had a reason to stay in one place, never had anyone to fight for. But Taya had her people, her land, her mission. She had a purpose, and Jesse could see how desperately she wanted to fulfill it. He leaned forward, looking her in the eyes. "When you're ready, I'll take you wherever you need to go. But you have to heal first. You don't want to go out there and end up weak again." Taya didn't reply at first. She seemed to weigh his words carefully before finally nodding. "I'll rest, for now." Over the next few days, Jesse kept himself busy, doing what he could to prepare for when the time would come for Taya to leave. He didn't want to think about it, but he knew it would happen sooner or later. He could tell she was struggling with the same thought. She didn't belong here in this cabin with him. She belonged out there, with her people. But in the quiet moments when they weren't talking, when Taya wasn't lost in her thoughts, Jesse couldn't help but notice the way they had begun to rely on each other. It wasn't just survival anymore. There was something deeper, something unspoken between them. He had never been one to talk about feelings, but there was a connection, a bond that he couldn't explain. It was on the 4th day after Taya had insisted she was ready to move on that they finally began to make plans. Jesse had spent hours preparing his horse, making sure it was strong enough for the journey ahead. Taya stood by the cabin window, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her eyes scanning the land. She had been quiet all morning, and Jesse knew she was deep in thought. "Where are you going?" he asked, breaking the silence. Taya turned to him, her eyes calm but full of purpose. "I need to find my people. The Nez Perce are scattered. They need help, and I'm the only one who can do something about it." Jesse nodded, understanding the gravity of her mission. He didn't know the full story, but he could tell that the Nez Perce were more than just a group of survivors. They were a proud people with a history, a culture, and a fight that wasn't over yet. And Taya was at the center of it all. "I'll take you as far as I can," Jesse said, walking over to the door ready to set out. "But after that, it's up to you." Taya looked at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. "I don't know what to say." Jesse smiled faintly. "You don't need to say anything, just be safe." As they packed up their belongings and made their way out of the cabin, Jesse couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would mark a turning point in both of their lives. They had both been running from something, he from his past and Taya from the destruction of her people. But now it seemed like they were both moving towards something that neither of them fully understood. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. The land was still wild and dangerous, filled with threats from all sides, and while the storm had passed, the war for the Nez Perce's land wasn't over. But Jesse couldn't bring himself to regret the choice he had made. Helping Taya had given him a reason to keep moving forward, something he hadn't had in years. They rode in silence for hours, the wind tugging at their clothes, the only sound being the soft thud of hooves against the dirt. Taya sat tall on her horse, her gaze focused on the path ahead. She was ready, Jesse could see that. Eventually, as the sun began to set and the shadows stretched long across the land, Taya spoke again.
"You, Jesse," she said, her voice steady.
"For everything. For not leaving me behind." Jesse glanced at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded. "Just be careful," he said. "Your fight's not over yet." Taya's lips curled into a small, quiet smile, but she said nothing more. Together they rode on, the quiet of the night surrounding them. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Jesse felt like he was walking down a path that might just lead somewhere worth going. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over the vast landscape. Jesse and Taya had been riding for hours, their journey taking them deeper into the heart of the wild frontier. The air was crisp, biting at their faces as they pressed forward. The path ahead was treacherous, the land covered with jagged rocks and thick forests. They were both tired, but neither of them spoke of stopping. They had a mission now. Taya had a purpose. Taya sat straight on her horse, her eyes scanning the horizon, always alert. Jesse kept his focus ahead as well, though he couldn't help but notice the strength in her now. It wasn't just the physical recovery she had made, though. That was impressive enough. It was the strength in her resolve, the way she carried herself like a leader. It made Jesse wonder what kind of woman she had been before all this, the woman who could inspire others to follow her, to fight alongside her. Jesse had seen his fair share of battles. He had fought for survival, but he had never been a leader. He had never cared for anyone else's fate, only his own. But Taya was different. She had a fire in her that burned bright, even in the coldest of times. She wasn't just surviving. She was fighting for something bigger. "Do you know where they are?" Jesse asked, his voice breaking the silence. The question had been lingering in his mind for hours, but he hadn't asked it until now. Taya turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she considered his question. "I'm not sure, but I know they'll be somewhere in the mountains. The Nez Perce were pushed there. They'll be hiding, waiting for their chance." Jesse nodded, absorbing her words. He didn't know much about the Nez Perce or their fight, but he knew enough to understand that their struggle wasn't just about land. It was about their survival as a people, and Taya, as their leader, was their last hope. As they continued their ride, the terrain began to shift. The trees grew thicker, the shadows darker. The air was colder and the wind howled through the branches. Jesse pulled his coat tighter around himself, his breath coming out in visible puffs. He glanced over at Taya, who seemed unfazed by the change in the weather. She had been through worse. A distant sound caught Jesse's attention, something he couldn't quite place. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But it grew louder, clearer. The sound of horses. Jesse's hand instinctively moved to the gun at his side. "Did you hear that?" he asked quietly, his eyes scanning the trees. Taya's gaze flicked to the left, where the noise seemed to be coming from. Her expression didn't change, but Jesse could see the alertness in her eyes. "It's them," she said simply, her voice steady. "The settlers." He had heard stories of settlers moving into the area, bringing with them armed men and ruthless mercenaries. It was clear that they wouldn't stop at just taking land. They would do whatever it took to wipe out anyone in their path. Taya kicked her horse into a trot, her pace quickening as she urged it forward. Jesse followed, his own horse struggling to keep up with hers. The noise grew louder, and soon they could see the figures moving through the trees. 4 men on horseback, armed and looking for trouble. Jesse's grip on his gun tightened, but Taya held up a hand, signaling him to stop. She slowed her horse, pulling it to a stop just behind a cluster of rocks. Jesse followed suit, his heart racing. They needed to make a plan, and fast. "We can't take 'em all on," Jesse said, his voice low. "We're outnumbered, and they're armed." Taya glanced at him, her eyes sharp.
I know, but we can't let them find us.
"We'll circle around, wait for the right moment to get close." Jesse didn't like it, but he knew Taya was right. They needed to act fast, but they had to be careful. A confrontation here would only draw more attention, and they couldn't afford to fight unless they had to. With a nod, Jesse followed her lead, guiding his horse through the dense trees. The two of them moved as quietly as possible, keeping low, avoiding the paths where the settlers might spot them. They made their way in a wide arc, circling around the group of men, trying to get closer without being seen. Taya led them through the woods, her eyes scanning the area ahead. Jesse kept a few paces behind, his eyes darting from one side to the other, watching for any sign of movement. His mind raced. If things went wrong, if they were spotted, they would be outgunned, outnumbered. But Taya had a calm confidence about her, and for some reason that steadied Jesse's nerves. After a few minutes, they emerged from the trees on the other side of the settlers. The men were spread out, moving cautiously through the woods, their attention focused on the ground, searching for tracks. Jesse and Taya kept their distance, watching from behind a thick cluster of trees. Taya turned to Jesse, her face determined. "We need to move quickly. There's a creek up ahead. We can use the water to cover our tracks." Jesse nodded, already ready to move. He could hear the settlers getting closer, their voices low but unmistakable. It wouldn't be long before they saw the tracks left by their horses. They pushed forward, breaking through the brush and heading toward the creek. The water was cold and swift, rushing between the rocks, but it was their best chance to escape. As they crossed the creek, the sound of the settlers grew quieter behind them. They had managed to stay undetected for now. When they reached the other side, they stopped for a moment, both of them catching their breath. The creek had given them some cover, but it wouldn't last long. "It needed to keep going," Taya said, her voice urgent. "The Nez Perce are close. I can feel it." Jesse looked at her, seeing the fire in her eyes again. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a leader, and she was ready for whatever lay ahead. He could see the fight in her, the same fight that had kept her alive through everything she had been through. It was a fight that had brought them this far. They rode on, keeping low, moving quickly through the trees. The sound of the settlers' horses faded into the distance, but they couldn't stop. They had to keep moving forward, keep pushing toward their goal. The world around them seemed to shrink as they moved deeper into the mountains. The trees grew thicker, the air colder. The terrain became more rugged, but Taya didn't slow. Her determination to find her people was stronger than anything else. Jesse followed her lead, his thoughts focused on the path ahead. He had never been a man who cared much for causes or fighting for something bigger than himself, but something about Taya, something about her fight, made him want to fight too. As the day stretched on, the landscape began to change again. The dense trees began to thin, and in the distance Jesse could see the faint outline of a mountain range. Taya's eyes brightened as she saw it too. "They're close," she said softly, her voice filled with a mix of hope and resolve. "I can feel it." The Nez Perce were out there, and Taya was going to find them. Together they would face whatever came next. The ride had been long and exhausting, but they were closer now than they had ever been, and Jesse knew that no matter what happened next, he would stand by her side.